When I first heard the words from the doctor, my entire world froze. The sterile smell of the hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor, and the fluorescent lights above me all blurred into the background. What stayed sharp, what pierced me deeply, was the diagnosis. My condition was not something that could be ignored or delayed. It wasn't something that could heal on its own with rest or time. It was life-threatening, urgent, and required immediate treatment. The doctor's voice was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of urgency, a kind of unspoken warning that told me the clock had already started ticking against me. I sat there, trying to absorb the gravity of what he was saying, but all I could hear in my head was one phrase repeating like an echo: "If you don't get this treatment, you won't survive." The reality of being young and facing something so final is something words struggle to capture. I wasn't thinking about dreams, career plans, or friendships. I wasn't even thinking about the future beyond a few weeks. My focus narrowed down to something very basic, very raw: survival. Every breath I took in that room felt heavier than the last, as if my body was reminding me of its fragility. The doctor explained the procedure, the timeline, and most importantly, the cost. It wasn't a treatment that could be postponed until we figured things out. It had to happen soon, before my condition worsened. And the truth was, I could already feel myself weakening, as if my body was trying to confirm every word he said. In moments like that, you expect your parents to step in, to put a reassuring hand on your shoulder, and tell you everything will be fine because they will find a way. But before even discussing how my family would respond, I had to wrestle with the fear that consumed me. The fear of not knowing how much time I had left. The fear of imagining the treatment being delayed even by a few days. The fear of wondering if tomorrow I would wake up weaker, if next week I wouldn't wake up at all. These weren't hypothetical worries, they were real, pressing, and terrifying. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing anymore, it became a prison of possibilities. Every time I looked at the nurses passing by, I wondered if they saw me as another patient with slim chances. Every time I heard the wheels of a stretcher rolling down the hallway, I wondered if that could soon be me. The walls closed in tighter with every passing hour, reminding me that my condition wasn't waiting for anyone's decision. It was moving forward, quietly but persistently, eroding my strength with each moment. I tried to think rationally about it. I told myself that medical science was advanced, that the treatment could work, that other people had survived similar battles. But rational thinking only carried me so far. The emotions hit harder: panic, helplessness, despair. I had never felt so small in my life, so at the mercy of circumstances beyond my control. The cruelest part was knowing the solution existed, but was locked behind something as cold as money. My life now had a price tag, and that realization was almost as crushing as the illness itself. As the days unfolded, I became more aware of my own body betraying me. Simple tasks became exhausting. Standing too long left me dizzy. Breathing sometimes felt like a chore. I could feel time slipping away, not in years, not even in months, but in days and hours. I would look in the mirror and see not just myself but a countdown, an image of someone who might not be there much longer. The urgency of the treatment wasn't just medical advice anymore. It was something my body screamed for every time I struggled to keep my eyes open or dragged myself across the room. In those quiet moments, when no one else was around, I let myself think about what it would mean if I didn't make it. I imagined the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence in my bedroom, the way my name would be spoken in past tense. I thought about the things I would leave unfinished, the conversations I would never have, the milestones I would never reach. But every time those thoughts came, I pushed them away with one stubborn belief: there was still hope if I could get the treatment. That hope became my anchor. It was fragile, sometimes barely there, but it was the only thing keeping me from drowning completely in despair. What made it harder was watching how others around me carried on. Friends would text me about school, about parties, about small things that suddenly felt so distant from my world. Their lives were moving forward, while mine was hanging by a thread. I wanted so badly to be part of their normal, to complain about deadlines or joke about weekend plans. But instead, I was trapped in a reality where every plan revolved around survival. The distance grew between me and the life I once had, and it was a constant reminder that without this treatment, I would never bridge that gap again. Would you like me to continue keynote number 1 until it fully reaches 700 words, or should I stop here and move on to expanding keynote number 2 next? When the doctor laid out the cost of my treatment, the next part of the conversation shifted from medicine to money. Numbers began to take the place of medical terms, and suddenly my survival was not just about science, but about finances. It wasn't just about what the doctors could do for me, it became about what my parents could afford to do. Sitting in that room, I could see the way my parents' expressions shifted when they realized what was required. They weren't only hearing about my condition, they were already calculating, already thinking about the weight of the financial burden, already comparing what was possible against what they had planned for. In most families, the idea of saving a child's life would be unquestionable, an instinctive choice. But in mine, there was hesitation, an uneasy silence that filled the air between us. I saw them exchange glances that were filled not with comfort or resolve, but with worry and conflict. I didn't need them to say it out loud to know what was running through their minds. They were thinking about resources, about the sacrifices they might have to make, about the future they had carefully mapped out for my brother, and how this unexpected crisis could disrupt it all. The dilemma was not just about money, but about priorities. Every family has plans, dreams, and responsibilities, but I never thought those plans could stand in direct opposition to my life. My parents had worked hard to save for years, putting aside funds for my brother's education, building a future for him that promised stability and opportunity. That was their vision of success, the hope they had nurtured. But now, that vision collided with my present reality, and the choice between saving a life and investing in a future became painfully real. I wanted to believe that when it came down to it, love would win. I wanted to believe that my parents would not hesitate to put everything they had toward keeping me alive. But their hesitation told me otherwise. I could feel the weight of their calculations pressing into the silence of the room, as though my worth was being measured against tuition fees, books, and degrees. It wasn't that they didn't care for me, I knew they did, but their actions showed a different kind of love, one shaped by duty, pressure, and expectations. The financial dilemma became a shadow that followed us home. Conversations at the dinner table grew quieter, and the tension became impossible to ignore. I would overhear whispered discussions between them late at night, hushed voices debating costs, timelines, and what was reasonable. They thought I was asleep, but I could hear enough to understand. My treatment wasn't just an expense, it was something they considered alongside other responsibilities. It wasn't about whether they loved me, it was about what they were willing to sacrifice to prove that love. I began to internalize that hesitation. Every time they looked at me with worry, I wondered if they saw me as a burden. I wondered if they were regretting the position they were in, forced to choose between two children they loved in different ways. The guilt weighed heavily on me. I didn't want to be the reason my brother's future was derailed, but I also didn't want to die because of a decision that placed education above survival. It was a cruel paradox, one I had no control over but had to endure in silence. The financial dilemma wasn't abstract, it was painfully specific. The hospital bills, the cost of medication, the price of the procedures, every number added up into something overwhelming. My parents weren't wealthy, and every decision came with a ripple effect. Paying for my treatment would mean draining years of savings, cutting back on essential expenses, and possibly giving up on the dream they had built for my brother's education. On the other hand, refusing the treatment meant facing the possibility of losing me. Either choice came with devastation, but only one of those choices would allow me to keep breathing. In their eyes, the future was tied to stability, to ensuring that my brother had the opportunities they never had. They believed education was a path out of struggle, a way to secure something permanent for the family. To them, saving me meant risking that security, while saving the money meant ensuring that at least one child had a guaranteed future. The weight of that reasoning made me feel invisible, as though my life was not permanent enough, not valuable enough, compared to the promise of education. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to beg them to see me as more than a financial decision. I wanted them to understand that my life, fragile as it was, deserved a chance. But I also knew the sacrifices they had made for years, the dreams they had built, and the expectations of the community around us. I could see how torn they were, how their sense of responsibility battled against their instincts as parents. The dilemma stretched beyond money. It fractured the very foundation of our family. Trust began to erode, and I found myself questioning not only their choices, but my place within their hearts. I wondered if love was enough to outweigh logic, if parental duty meant protecting both children equally or choosing the one who seemed to promise more for the future. And while I was trapped in that uncertainty, my condition continued to worsen, reminding me that time was running out even as they hesitated. When the decision finally became clear, it was not spoken with anger or cruelty, but with a quiet finality that cut deeper than any harsh word ever could. My parents had chosen to direct the money toward my brother's college tuition instead of my treatment. They tried to explain it in ways that made sense to them. Education was an investment, something that could not be delayed, something that would secure a better life not just for him but for the family as a whole. They said that the world was unforgiving, that opportunities for higher education didn't come often, and that they couldn't risk letting this chance slip away. But what I heard beneath their carefully chosen words was something much colder. My life had been weighed against his education, and I had come up short. The conversation replayed in my head endlessly. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she explained how hard it had been to come to this decision, and my father's voice cracked as he told me they still loved me, that this didn't mean I wasn't important to them. But the words rang hollow because their actions said something entirely different. Love without sacrifice feels empty when you're the one left gasping for breath, begging silently for more time. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to hold on to the idea that parents will always choose their child's life first, but the reality in front of me refused to bend to that hope. I thought about my brother, about how unaware he seemed of the storm happening beneath our roof. He was excited about his upcoming classes, about the future that now seemed guaranteed for him. I didn't blame him for having dreams or for wanting to pursue them, but I couldn't ignore the fact that his dreams were being built on the foundation of my suffering. I watched him make plans for dorm life, talk about the courses he wanted to take, laugh with his friends about the next chapter of his life, and it was as if I was watching someone live the life I was being denied. Every smile of his felt like a reminder of what I was losing. The divide between us grew silently but sharply. I couldn't look at him without feeling the sting of betrayal, even though he wasn't the one who had made the choice. It wasn't his fault, yet he was the one who benefited while I was left with the consequences. He became the embodiment of my parents' decision, the living reminder that they valued his potential more than my existence. Whenever he talked about his future, I stayed silent, pretending to listen, pretending to support him, while inside I was crumbling under the weight of being sacrificed for his opportunity. I wondered if he ever felt guilty, if he ever questioned what it meant that his education came at such a cost. But if he did, he never showed it. Maybe he couldn't bear to acknowledge it, or maybe my parents shielded him from the truth, wanting him to focus on the bright road ahead. Either way, I carried the burden alone, the knowledge that while he stepped into classrooms filled with promise, I was left counting the days my body could still hold on without the treatment. The house became quieter, not in sound but in spirit. Every interaction carried tension. Every meal shared at the table felt like we were eating around an unspoken truth. My parents tried to act as though things were normal, but normal had been shattered the moment they chose. They spoke of college applications, deadlines, and financial aid, their voices filled with a kind of pride that I could no longer connect with. In the same breath, they avoided talking about my condition, as if silence could erase the reality of what I was enduring. At night, I lay awake wondering what it meant to be a child in a family where your worth could be measured in dollars and dreams. I thought about the things my parents had always taught me growing up, that family sticks together, that love means sacrifice, that we would always put each other first. Those lessons now felt like illusions, broken promises that dissolved in the face of a choice they had made with calculation rather than compassion. It was hard to reconcile the parents who once held me when I was sick as a child with the ones who now looked at me as a financial dilemma. There were moments I wanted to scream, moments I wanted to ask them if they would ever forgive themselves if I didn't make it. I wanted to know if my absence at future family gatherings would haunt them, if they would look at my brother's diploma and wonder what it had cost. But I stayed silent, swallowed by a mix of anger and exhaustion. Speaking those words felt pointless when the decision had already been made. The days moved forward, each one blurring into the next, and I watched my brother pack his bags for college while I unpacked the weight of being left behind. His future was being secured in classrooms and lecture halls, while mine was slipping away in hospital corridors and sleepless nights. My parents' choice had drawn a line that couldn't be erased, a line that separated survival from ambition, existence from opportunity. And I was left on the side that no one had chosen. The moment the decision was made, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about the treatment anymore. It was about the realization that the people I trusted most in this world had chosen a path that left me behind. The feeling of betrayal was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the kind of betrayal that comes from strangers or distant acquaintances. This was deeper, sharper, because it came from my own parents, the ones who were supposed to protect me above all else. It felt like the ground beneath me had cracked open, and I was falling into a void where love and safety no longer meant what I thought they did. I replayed every childhood memory, the times they held my hand crossing the street, the nights they stayed up when I had a fever, the sacrifices they claimed they made for me. All those moments that had once felt like proof of unconditional love now felt like fragments of a story that had crumbled. How could those same hands now push me aside for the sake of something they considered more valuable? The contradiction was unbearable. I wanted to cling to the belief that they loved me just as much as they loved my brother, but their choice made it impossible to hold on to that belief without feeling like a fool. The sense of abandonment was just as suffocating as the betrayal. Lying awake at night, I realized that I was truly on my own in this fight for survival. The people I expected to stand by me had already stepped back. Their silence in the face of my pain screamed louder than any words could. I felt like I was fading in their eyes, becoming less of a child and more of a problem they couldn't afford to solve. The loneliness that came with that realization settled into my bones, heavy and cold, and it made the hospital walls feel like they were closing in tighter every day. Even in their presence, I felt abandoned. They still cooked meals, still asked me if I needed anything, still went through the motions of parental care, but beneath those actions was an emptiness I couldn't ignore. It was as though they were doing these things out of obligation, not out of the desperate love that should come when your child's life is on the line. I looked into their eyes searching for that spark of determination to save me at any cost, and all I found was resignation. That was perhaps the cruelest part, to see them accept the possibility of losing me when I wasn't ready to accept it myself. The betrayal seeped into the smallest moments. A conversation about bills, a glance exchanged between them when they thought I wasn't watching, the way they avoided certain topics whenever I was in the room. Each gesture reminded me of the decision they had made and the wall it built between us. I began to feel like a stranger in my own family, someone they could still smile at but no longer truly see. Their love, once a source of strength, now felt conditional, something that could be withheld when weighed against something else they valued more. I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize why they had done what they did. Maybe they believed my brother's future could carry the family forward. Maybe they thought education was a more reliable investment than uncertain medical treatment. Maybe they convinced themselves that the odds of me surviving weren't high enough to justify the expense. But no matter how many explanations I turned over in my head, none of them softened the wound. Because at the end of it all, the truth remained the same. They had chosen him over me. They had abandoned me in the one moment I needed them most. The pain of that realization followed me everywhere. When I walked past family photos hanging on the walls, I wondered if they would look at them years later and feel regret. When I sat at the dinner table, I wondered if my empty chair would eventually be forgotten, replaced by stories of my brother's achievements. When I closed my eyes, I imagined futures that would never exist for me because I had not been given the chance to fight. The sense of betrayal twisted into every part of my daily life, making ordinary moments feel unbearable. I began to question my own worth. Was I truly so easy to set aside? Was my life worth so little that a tuition bill could outweigh it? Those questions echoed in my mind constantly, leaving me with a hollow ache that no words of comfort could fill. It wasn't just that my parents had made a choice, it was that their choice made me doubt my own value as a human being, as their child, as someone deserving of love and protection. The abandonment also reshaped the way I saw relationships beyond my family. If my own parents could leave me to suffer, who else could I trust? The foundation I had always relied on was cracked, and with it, my ability to believe in security and loyalty. Every interaction carried the weight of suspicion. Every gesture of kindness made me wonder if it too would disappear the moment it was tested. The betrayal had not only broken my bond with them, but had begun to fracture my understanding of love itself. The struggle that consumed me was not only about illness or survival, but about the question of where I truly stood within my own family. On one side was the unshakable duty I had been taught all my life, the lesson that family sacrifices for one another, that we are bound to protect each other no matter the cost. On the other side was the gnawing truth that my parents had placed my life in a position where it was competing against my brother's future. It became a battle of worth, a comparison I never asked to be part of but was forced into the moment they chose to prioritize tuition over treatment. I found myself torn between anger and guilt. Anger, because I could not understand how my parents could turn away from me when my body was failing. Guilt, because part of me wondered if I was being selfish for wanting them to sacrifice my brother's education for my survival. That conflict played over and over in my head like a storm I couldn't escape. I was raised to believe that family duty meant doing everything possible to keep each other safe, but what did that principle mean if I was the one exception? Did duty only apply when it didn't disrupt plans or cost too much? Or was my life somehow less important than I believed it to be? The weight of comparison pressed down on me in ways I had never felt before. My brother's worth was being measured in potential, in the promise of degrees, careers, and stability, while mine was being measured in hospital bills, risks, and uncertainties. I could not ignore how different those scales looked. He represented the future, and I represented a problem that needed solving. Every time my parents praised his accomplishments or spoke with pride about the opportunities awaiting him, I felt myself shrinking, as if I was disappearing into the background of their lives. I wanted to scream that I mattered too, that my existence was not just a financial equation, but the fear of being dismissed kept my voice trapped inside me. This internal struggle spilled into every moment of my daily life. When my parents asked how I was feeling, I wanted to tell them about the pain, the exhaustion, the way I could feel my body weakening each day, but instead I kept my answers short. Part of me didn't want to burden them further, as if my silence could make me less of a problem. At the same time, my silence was a form of quiet rebellion, a way of saying that if they had chosen not to fight for me, then I would carry my pain without giving them the comfort of believing everything was fine. The conflict between family duty and personal worth was also mirrored in how I viewed my brother. I didn't want to resent him, because none of this was his choice, but I couldn't stop myself from feeling bitterness when I saw the excitement in his eyes about his future. He had the privilege of moving forward while I was left behind, and even if he never asked for that privilege, it was impossible for me to ignore. I wondered if he ever thought about what I was losing so he could gain, or if he was simply too young, too focused on his own life to grasp the depth of the sacrifice being made on my behalf, or rather, against me. I began questioning what it meant to be valued. Was value something given unconditionally, or was it always tied to what you could provide in return? My brother could provide pride, success, the image of a child fulfilling the dreams of his parents. I could only provide struggle, medical bills, and a fight for survival that had no guarantee of success. If worth was measured in outcomes, then perhaps I had already lost the battle before it even began. That realization crushed me in ways that my illness never could, because it struck at the very core of my identity as a daughter, as a sibling, as a person. Every conversation with my parents felt like a test of loyalty. They still told me they loved me, still offered words of comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that their actions contradicted their words. I wanted to believe them, but the choice they made lingered between us like a wall I couldn't climb. Love, I realized, is not only measured in words, but in the sacrifices we are willing to make for each other. Their unwillingness to sacrifice for me left me questioning whether I truly belonged, or whether I was only part of the family when it was convenient. The struggle was not only about my parents, but about me as well. I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I was being unfair for expecting them to risk so much for me. Was it wrong of me to want to live, even if it meant my brother's dreams would be delayed? Was I selfish for believing that my life should come before his education? These questions haunted me, twisting every moment of reflection into a cycle of doubt and self-blame. I was caught between the instinct to fight for myself and the guilt of potentially taking something away from him. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I was trapped in a cruel paradox. If I demanded the treatment, I risked being the reason my brother's future was derailed. If I stayed silent and accepted their choice, I risked losing my life without ever having the chance to fight for it. Both paths led to pain, but one would mean carrying the weight of guilt while the other meant facing the reality of being abandoned. That impossible balance between family duty and personal worth consumed me, leaving me with no clear answers, only the heavy ache of knowing that love had been tested and found wanting. Trust is something that takes years to build, often starting from the earliest moments of childhood. It is formed when parents pick you up after a fall, when they whisper promises of safety, when they assure you that no matter what happens, they will always be there. For most of my life, I believed in that trust without question. I thought it was unshakable, a bond that could never be broken. But when the choice was made to prioritize my brother's college tuition over my treatment, that trust shattered into fragments I could never piece together the same way again. The people who once felt like my strongest shield suddenly became the very reason I felt exposed, fragile, and unprotected. Resilience was something I didn't know I had until I was forced into it. At first, I felt like I was drowning in despair, unable to see beyond the betrayal and abandonment. But the longer I sat with my pain, the more I realized that if I waited for someone else to save me, I might never be saved at all. That realization was both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it meant I could not rely on the people I thought I could. Empowering because it reminded me that survival sometimes comes from within. I started to find small ways to push through, waking up each day despite the weight on my chest, reminding myself that my voice and my existence mattered even if others failed to see it. My identity began to change in ways I hadn't expected. I was no longer just a daughter or a sister. Those roles felt distant, almost hollow, because they no longer represented safety or belonging. Instead, I began to see myself as someone who had to define their own value, independent of the approval or validation of family. It was painful to let go of the belief that my worth was tied to their love, but it also opened a path for me to rediscover who I was outside of their choices. My illness had already stripped me of normalcy, but their decision forced me to rebuild my sense of self from the ground up. I began reflecting on the meaning of love and what it should look like. For so long, I believed love meant sacrifice, loyalty, and protection. Now, I realized that love could also be conditional, shaped by expectations, resources, and calculations. That realization didn't just alter how I viewed my parents, it reshaped how I viewed relationships altogether. I became cautious, wary of trusting too quickly, afraid that others would one day measure me the way my parents did, against something more valuable, against a dream or an opportunity that didn't include me. Yet, within that caution was a kind of resilience, an ability to recognize red flags, to set boundaries, and to protect myself in ways I had never considered before. Resilience also meant finding strength in places I never thought to look. I began journaling, pouring out the emotions I couldn't say aloud, turning pain into words that gave me clarity. I found comfort in small routines, in the quiet strength of enduring one day at a time. I learned that resilience doesn't always mean grand acts of bravery. Sometimes it is simply breathing through the weight of disappointment, refusing to let it crush you entirely. Each moment I chose to keep going, even when I felt invisible, became a declaration of my own worth. The redefinition of identity came with a sense of loss, but also with an unexpected sense of freedom. If my worth was no longer tied to my family's choices, then I had the power to define it myself. I was not just the child who was left behind, not just the patient whose treatment was deemed too expensive. I was someone who could carry pain and still stand, someone who could endure betrayal and still believe in the possibility of something better. My identity was no longer rooted in being their daughter, it was rooted in being my own person, one who had survived the collapse of trust and learned to rise anyway. Trust, resilience, and identity became intertwined in my story. The loss of trust pushed me into resilience, and resilience forced me to rebuild my identity. I no longer looked at myself through the same lens I once did. I was not defined by my illness, nor by the choice that had been made against me. Instead, I was defined by how I responded to it, by the strength I discovered when I thought I had none, by the way I managed to carve out meaning in the midst of abandonment. It wasn't a path I had chosen, but it was one that revealed layers of myself I might never have known otherwise. In redefining myself, I also began to think about the future in a different way. It wasn't about chasing the same milestones my brother was reaching or trying to compete with what my parents valued. It was about creating my own measure of success, one that didn't rely on anyone else's validation. Survival itself became a kind of success, not just physically but emotionally. Every time I refused to let despair consume me, I proved that resilience was more than just endurance, it was transformation. My identity was no longer about being the one left behind, it was about being the one who refused to disappear, even when everything seemed designed to erase me.